Hi, she's on the moneyers, Molly here. So today we're going to be talking about things you need to think about before tying the knot. And we're joined by Rosemary Sharp, who is a partner at the law firm Lester Aldridge. These guys deal a lot with family law. So Rosemary has seen it all when it comes to marriage and divorces, and's got a really good understanding of the small things that women and men can do to stay protected and should legally be aware of before they go into it all. We know it's not the most romantic topic to talk about when you're newly engaged. You're thinking about, the dresses, the prosecco, or the champagne. Where you're going to get married, you're not thinking about, do I need a prenup? But we've seen those couples that we never thought would get divorced. So it's an important one to think about. So here we go, guys. Things to think about before tying the knot. So I guess just to kick it off, so when it comes to our finances, what do we really need to know about our partner?
Well, I think it's really a case of getting ahead of the game. And yes, we don't want things to go wrong. We're not planning for things to go wrong. But, certainly in my line of work, I see so many situations where things have gone wrong for various reasons. And there are just things that people could have done to put themselves in a better position. And it's really just educating people, particularly women, so that they know sort of how they can just make sure that, that they're not doing themselves down or missing a trick and that they come to later regret. So I think what's really important before getting married is to make sure that you know about each other's finances. Mm-hmm. So, things like know about if people have lots of savings or don't have any savings, or if they've got debt that they're having to pay off. There's been a recent Relate report which said 1 in 7 people hide debt from their partners. And I'm sure it's because, people are embarrassed and, they don't want to say that they've got themselves into difficulty. But actually, it's really important that you know about it going into a marriage so it's not a nasty surprise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I imagine those conversations can sometimes probably be quite awkward at the start, but they're really important to have so you kind of know where you're both sitting.
Exactly. I think, you're a team. And so, you've got to know what each other's got or not got. And then you can choose how you're going to deal with it as a couple.
Great. And just when it comes to organizing your finances before you go into a relationship, what are kind of some of the things you should be thinking about, whether it's to make yourself to have that conversation around the pension chat if you're going to have children, or what are some really important things to think about?
So I think everyone organizes their finances differently. And that's one thing that's really interesting in my job is that everyone has a different take on how they decide to run their finances as a couple. So things to think about are, are you going to have everything in a joint account? So both salaries going in, all the bills going out, it's a free-for-all. Or are you going to say, actually, we're going to have separate accounts. We might have a joint account for bills, but we're going to keep our own accounts separate. I think there's something to be said for having separate funds. I think it helps people, women in particular, have a degree of independence, that they don't feel entirely reliant on their partner, which can affect the dynamic of the relationship, and also, how women feel in the relationship, that, they're sort of beholden to their partners. There's also something to be said for if you're keeping finances separate, if the worst does happen and you do decide to divorce, then it can be easier to try and protect those funds if they're in an account in your own name rather than a joint account.
Okay, interesting. And so I know with getting married, it's really exciting because you're picking the dresses and the rings and what champagne are you going to have. But what does getting married legally mean?
So I think you're absolutely right. I think that, people get so excited about the wedding day and obviously their lives together, and they forget that marriage is a legal contract. So you're actually entering into a legal contract with someone, and that contract has rights and responsibilities towards each other, particularly financial rights and responsibilities. And those responsibilities in particular don't end when the relationship breaks down. And that's where people can make claims against one another for things like housing, income, pensions after they've separated. And those claims remain intact, and it doesn't matter whose fault it was that the relationship broke down. Those people still have claims. So I think, people just need to bear in mind that, it is a big undertaking. It's a legal contract, and it is different from living together. You do get different rights and responsibilities when you're married.
And is there any way to protect your assets that you have before you go into a marriage? So say like I have an apartment, which I don't, but say I had an apartment and I'm marrying someone who doesn't. Is there, I know it's not, again, it's not like romantic, but is there any way I can stay protected so going in, that's seen as my asset?
So yes, so the classic sort of thing that everyone will have heard of is a prenuptial agreement. So prenuptial agreements aren't legally binding in England and Wales automatically, but they will carry significant weight, and the family courts have said that they will uphold prenuptial agreements if certain criteria are met. The prenuptial agreement can't leave one party completely high and dry, so you can't have prenuptial agreements where someone doesn't get anything unless they have their own funds that they can rely on. And I think that, you know, prenuptial agreements are really good for people that have received inherited assets, or they think they're going to receive inherited assets, or if they've got businesses or assets that they're bringing into the marriage that they say, actually, if we do get divorced, I want to be able to ring fence those and protect them. And I think that, you know, that they're definitely worth looking into. And, you know, we're seeing in the last sort of few years, we've definitely seen a lot more people inquiring about them and having prenuptial agreements. Hopefully they sit in a drawer gathering dust, never to be looked at again. But there have been numerous occasions when people have come to see me that they haven't had a prenuptial agreement, and it's on the tip of my tongue to say to them, it would have been great if you had a prenuptial agreement, but, you know, you haven't. I'm not going to put salt in the wound, but it's definitely something people should think about.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And just on that, do you have to get a lawyer to do a prenuptial agreement?
So both parties should get independent legal advice, and that's one of the criteria, really, to make sure that both people understand what they're potentially giving up or what they're potentially getting in the prenuptial agreement. So what you don't want is there to be any suggestion that someone says, well, I didn't understand what it meant, or I didn't quite understand what the implications were. You want to make sure that everyone's had the legal advice, so there's no reason to try and say it shouldn't be upheld.
Okay, cool. And getting married abroad, so you have a destination wedding. What are the kind of things you need to think about legally from that perspective?
So I think the biggest thing with getting married abroad, and it may sound really silly, but to make sure that your wedding is actually valid. So if you're getting married abroad, in order to be valid, your wedding has to comply with the laws of that country. So if you're getting married in France, you have to make sure that your wedding complies with the French law of what constitutes a valid marriage.
Okay.
So that can sometimes be tricky to satisfy if you don't meet the criteria. And what I'd always suggest is that if you're in doubt, or you think, actually, I'm not quite sure we are able to meet the criteria, then have a civil ceremony in the UK and then celebration abroad. And you can still have your big day abroad, but you know that you've got it legally, it's done legally. I think that the story you always hear is Mick Jagger and Jerry Hall. They were married, I think it was in Indonesia, and they had a Hindu wedding ceremony, I think. And they found out later that they were never legally married because their wedding didn't comply with the laws of the country.
Okay.
And that was after sort of 20 years of marriage and 4 children or whatever it was. So it's really important to make sure you tick that box, and if in doubt, say have the legal ceremony in the UK and then a celebration abroad.
That's a good tip. Make sure you're actually married when you get married. And then I guess when you live abroad, if you're married, you're living abroad, and say, again, like worst case scenario, you get divorced. Does the country where you end up affect the divorce, or does it get done in the country where you originally married? Like, how does that work?
So the easy answer is it all depends.
Okay.
So sometimes if you're living abroad, you might still be able to get divorced in England, but you may also be able to get divorced in the country where you're living.
Okay.
And then sometimes it can be, depending on what country you're living in, it can be a case of, well, who gets there first with the divorce petition, in which country. And some countries are going to be better off for husbands, some countries are going to be better off for wives in terms of the financial provision the law says each person should get on a divorce. So I think if you're living abroad, you need to think about whether you want the laws of England and Wales to apply to any divorce. And that also really factors into a prenuptial agreement where you can agree that if a divorce does happen, you will get divorced in England.
Okay.
But otherwise, it's a case of looking at the time to say, I'm thinking about a divorce, I'm living in this country. Is it good? Is it better for me to divorce in this country, or am I better off divorcing in England? And sometimes, as I say, it can be a case of who gets there first.
Kind of what legally do we need to know about buying a house together?
So I think the thing to think about is how you're going to own the house. So is the house going to be in one person's name? Is it going to be in joint names? And if it's in joint names, then some people don't know that there are two different types of joint ownership. So the first kind is joint tenants. And that's where you own the house equally. And if one of you died, then your share would automatically pass to the other owner.
Okay.
And it doesn't pass under your will. So the second type of joint ownership is called tenants in common. Now, you can have tenants in common with 50-50 ownership, or you can own it in a different proportion, so 40-60 or 70-30 or whatever proportion you decide. The difference with tenants in common is that if you died, your share would pass under your will, so it doesn't automatically go to the other owner.
Oh, okay.
So it's important, it links in with the will point, and is really important that you make sure that you and your partner are on the same page and you know what each other is planning. But it's also important to remember that before you get married, some people have a declaration of trust, which records that perhaps you've made unequal contributions to the purchase price. So maybe one of you put more deposit down than the other. And when you're living together, that's fine, and that declaration of trust is binding. But when you get married, a lot of people forget or don't realise that that declaration of trust is no longer binding, and that might not be the end result if you get divorced. So if you have a prenuptial agreement, if you have a declaration of trust and you get married, it's always worth looking at a prenuptial agreement to replace the declaration of trust.
Okay, so the declaration of trust is pre-marriage.
Pre-marriage, and it can be any people that are living together. So it doesn't just have to be boyfriend and girlfriend. It can be family members, friends, and that's what you want to have. But if you get married, then the declaration of trust is no longer binding.
So final question, just around wills. So I know this is something a lot of people my age, we don't really think about, but how important is it to have a will?
So I think it's really important to have a will. If you don't have a will and you pass away, then your estate will be divided according to the intestacy rules. And that means that your estate may not go to the people that you want it to. So it's far better to have a will. And they can be very straightforward to put in place to make sure that you know that your assets are going to the people that you want them to. And that's all there is to it, really. I think otherwise you're leaving it in someone else's hands. Ultimately, you're leaving it in the government's hands to say who they think your estate should go to, and you might not have the same view.
Okay, great. Well, that's given definitely us a lot to think about before tying the knot. Thank you so much for your time. That was, really interesting. And again, guys, that was Rosemary Sharp, who's a partner at Lester Aldridge. Thank you so much for your time. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Molly. Bye.